Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Crop. I'm Anna Heslop and today I'm talking to FAR CEO Alison Stewart about the current agricultural emissions consultation process. Now, most of you will have some knowledge of this process, but with the consultation period coinciding with harvest, and a pretty horrible harvest at that, many of you we know haven't had time to focus on that yet. But the problem is, it's not an issue that you can actually ignore, and you only have until the end of March to learn about the options and to have your say. So what we're going to do today is ask Alison to provide a summary of all the options that are being discussed under the He Waka Eke Noa pricing schemes. And then at the end, I'm going to ask her a few questions, which are currently the common ones we're getting from farmers like you. So over to you, Alison.
Thank you, Anna. So you and I have been knee-deep in this for quite a while, and obviously some of the growers won't. So just to give the growers a little bit of a high-level sort of outline of where we've got to. The most important thing is to understand that the He Waka Eke Noa partnership is all about trying to support our farmers to understand and manage their emissions and to be able to support the government's targets for reducing emissions for both short and long-lived gases. And as part of that, there will be the introduction of an emissions pricing scheme, which has to come in place by 2025. And so the consultation is all about what those emissions pricing options might be. And when we're talking about emissions, we're talking about methane, obviously from ruminant livestock. We're talking about nitrous oxide, mainly from nitrogen fertiliser, and carbon dioxide, which is sort of mainly urea N, but obviously, fuel and things like that also emit CO2, but that's already captured within the ETS. The other thing that I think growers will have to understand is that some of the options that are being presented are looking at a split gas option. And what that means is that we would price short-lived gases and long-lived gases separately. So the short-lived gases is methane and the long-lived gases is nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. And so the two options that the industry sectors are putting forward are where there's a split gas way of collecting the emissions levy. The other thing to recognise is that we're also proposing that there should be the ability to get a broader range of sequestration options. So one of the things that we're trying to put on the table is that instead of just ETS eligible sort of forests, that there is a wider range like riparian planting, biodiversity plantings, small woodlots, even perennial horticulture, some perennial horticultural crops, that there could be recognition and payment or credit for on-farm sequestration. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't include annual crops like, arable crops and maize and vegetable, because they're not in the ground long enough for that carbon to meaningfully build up and be able to be measured. And at this moment in time, soil sequestration is not on the list of potential offsets. And that's related to the fact that we don't necessarily have the data and the soil mapping platform in place to be able to capture that. But that is something that is going to be worked on, and at some stage in the future, soil sequestration may be able to be sort of captured in some way. The timeline, as you've said, it's very tight. We're in the consultation process with growers at the moment. By the end of March, we have to pull together all of that feedback, and the Hawaka Ekanoa partners have to reach a consensus about which pricing option they want to propose and recommend to the minister, and that's all got to be done by end of May, and then the minister will give feedback probably by the end of this year on which pricing option the government's going to go with. And so the key thing is that there are 3 options that we are taking out and discussing with the growers. The first is the backstop option, which is basically the ETS, and that's what the government had always intended that growers were and farmers were going to have to sign up to. The Hawaka Ekanoa partners have put forward 2 alternatives, a farm level levy option and a processor hybrid level levy option. But I think the key thing I'd like to say before we start talking about the 3 options is that I think growers have to look at this and they have to ask themselves some important sort of considerations. So yes, obviously, growers are going to say, how's this going to impact on my farm? And that's human nature. You want to know what the financial impact is going to be on your own business. I think we would like growers to also look at it from the perspective of the wider agricultural industry. I think a question that you have to ask is, how much control will I have in being able to manage my emissions? And then I think the other thing is, are there opportunities for me to be rewarded or recognised for things that I'm doing on my farm? And then I guess the really big question, which sometimes it's easy to forget, is will any of these options actually result in meaningful emissions reductions? And, and if it doesn't, you then have to beg the question, why on earth are we doing it? So let's just sort of, keep that in mind as we go through this presentation. So if we take the ETS backstop, this is where both short-lived and long-lived gases will be taxed at the same price, and that will be directly linked to the ETS. And so the way that will happen is that the meat and milk and wool processors and the fertiliser companies will have to report and pay for the short-lived and long-lived emissions, and that will be based on a national emissions average. And not surprisingly, they will then pass those costs down the supply chain to the farmers and the growers, and that will either be through reduced payouts for things like milk and meat, or it will be increased cost of fertiliser. And in the backstop, there at this moment in time, there really isn't much opportunity for any rebates or rewards or additional sequestration offset options. I guess the advantage of the ETS is that it's already in existence, and therefore the establishment and admin costs will be relatively small. But as you can see, if we look at this table, and this is a table that has been worked up by some of the modelers that have been working as part of the Hawaka Ekanoa partnership, and they've been modelling a whole range of different farm systems. And the arable system that they modelled is a 250 hectare irrigated mixed arable farm in mid-Canterbury. And they've basically modelled under the ETS, what would the cost be to that farm business? And it's based on a modelled price in 2025 of $85 per tonne, with a 95% discount. And so the government is basically saying, when the pricing scheme starts, you'll get a 95% discount, so you only have to pay 5% of that tax. But then each year after that, it will go down 1%. So by 2030, you'll then be paying 10%. And it will go down. And so in this table, you can see that in 2025, a typical mixed arable farm would be paying about $7,500 in emissions levy, which has been modelled as being a minus 2.4% impact on effective farm surplus. In 2030, the cost to the farm, because of course we're predicting that the carbon price will increase, and the modelling is looking at $138 per tonne, then that's going to go up to more than $24,000, and they're looking at an effective farm surplus impact of minus 7.8. Now, of course, we already know that, carbon price is up at $84, $85 already. And so even this modelling is now out of date, and trying to imagine what the carbon price will be in 2025 and 2030, that's where the big risk is in understanding what the financial impact on your farm might be. So that's the ETS. If we now look to the two options that the Hiwaka Ekanoa partners are put forward, the first option is the farm level split gas option. And that's, as I said before, that's where we're going to charge a different price, set a different levy for short-lived gas, which is methane, and nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide as long-lived gases. And the reason for that is because obviously the targets that New Zealand has to make for short and long-lived gases are different, and you don't have to reach zero for methane, but we do have to get to zero for both nitrous oxide and CO2. And so, using a different price lever makes sense. So in this particular one, then it's your actual emissions on your farm that will get calculated. And so the farmers will calculate their emissions using a single calculator, and they will then pay, sort of the cost of those emissions rather than using national averages. So if you're a very efficient farm with low emissions, you'll pay less than a farm that is a high emitter. The other good thing about this option is that within the greenhouse gas calculation, there will be opportunities to be recognised for mitigations that you're implementing on your farm. And so, you might be using, nitrate inhibitor, or you might be using coated urea product, or anything that can be easily recorded and verified as a practice that you're implementing that is known to reduce emissions. You can then get a credit for that within that calculation. And then the other good thing is that those broader range of sequestration offsets, you will be able to use them to be able to, as I say, offset some of the cost of the emissions levy. So as you can see in I think it's really important that we point out actually what the definition of a farm is, because there will be some people that actually would even be defined as a farm and therefore don't actually have to be part of this pricing scheme. And so on this slide, you'll see what the definition of a farm is going to be. And it's going to be any business that's GST registered and has an annual average over any of the following criteria. Either applying 40 tonnes of applied synthetic nitrogen per year per property, and or sort of having livestock units, as illustrated, 550 stock units of sheep, cattle, deer, goats, 50 dairy cattle, 700 swine, 50,000 poultry. And the reason they've chosen this is because it basically captures the vast majority of farms that are emitting over 200 tonnes of CO2 equivalents per year. So there will be some farms that will be below that, and in the farm level pricing option, they may actually get a out of jail card and not have to actually be part of it. But for most arable growers, they'll either get captured by the 40 tonnes of applied synthetic nitrogen or the livestock stock units. Okay, so if we look at this slide, this basically shows you what the calculation is going to look like. It's basically A plus B minus C equals how much you have to pay. And A will be the cost for your short-lived gas emissions. B will be the cost for your long-lived emissions, taking into account that there will be within that calculation recognition for mitigation practices, and then taking away from that any value that you can bring to the table through sequestration, and the total then will be how much you have to pay. So if you go back to the modelling that we talked about, and on this slide we can see the modelling that's been done under the same farm system for the farm level option, you can see in 2025 that the A plus B, which is your emissions levy, will be just over $4,000. There may be a minor, small amount of sequestration offsets that you might be able to claim, and it's predicted that your impact on your farm surplus would be around negative 1%. By 2030, that will go up to close to 14,000 levy on emissions, similar amount of sequestration offsets, with an impact on your farm business of around minus 3.9%. So that looks a little bit better than the ETS. If we talk about the processor hybrid level, this is it's a little bit similar to the ETS in the sense that the processors will pay. And that will again be on, products supplied or fertiliser bought using national emissions factors. But the difference is that methane and nitrous oxide will be priced separately. So the split gas levy will be a factor that's brought into this that is not present in the ETS. The other important thing is that there will be the opportunity to, and on a voluntary basis, to be able to enter into either an emissions management contract where you try and get payment for activities that reduce emissions, and or a sequestration management contract, and this is where you could get paid for some sequestration activities that you've got on farm. So if we look at the calculation here on this slide, you can see that the calculation is A plus B, which is the same as we've mentioned before, cost of short-lived gas plus cost of long-lived gas, and that will be the amount of levy that you have to pay. And then, if you choose to, you can then voluntarily, as an individual or as a collective, you can enter into an emissions management contract and or a sequestration management contract, and that will get you some payments that can offset some of those emissions levies. And if you look at the modelling that was been done for that option, because what they've done with the modelling, they've basically just modelled it on the basis of the same forecasted carbon price, then it really doesn't look much different for an arable farm, because the levy will be similar to the ETS, 7,500 in 2025 and 24,000 in 2030. There will be some opportunity to get sequestration credits. This model has indicated that it's unlikely that there'll be many opportunities to get credits through an emissions management contract, but that's still up for negotiation. And obviously FAR and federated farmers, we're going to proactively look to see if we can get something that on the list of mitigation practices that might allow arable farmers to be able to get some credit. So from the point of view of impact on farm surplus, it's a little bit better than the ETS, minus 2.1% in 2025 and minus 7.2% in 2030. So obviously, that's one arable farm that's been modelled, and we know that arable farms are incredibly diverse, and and some have a whole range of different types of livestock integrated into the system. Some don't. Some have a different range of rotation crops, and so it would be almost impossible to be able to make generic statements around how these various options would impact on an arable farm if you only ever looked at one mixed arable farm from Canterbury. So FAR did pull together data from 20 different arable systems, just so we could try and get a little bit more of an insight into what the impact might be. So if we look at this table, you'll see that we have identified across those 20 farms that we're probably looking at, the low that farms with only arable crops are probably going to have the lowest emissions profile, round about, sort of 1,200 kilograms CO2 equivalents per hectare. Those with quite a lot of livestock in the system could be as high as 5,500, but with an average around 3,000. If you translate that into the farm level, and we've done all our modelling on the farm level, then you'd be looking at a 2025 estimated costs of a range between $2 and $24 per hectare, with an average of 14, and then going up to 17 to 78 range, with an average of 44 in 2030. And so that starts to give you a bit of an idea, the more livestock you have in the system, then the more emissions that, that you're going to have to pay for. And we took it to another level, and this is probably the most detailed table that we're presenting here. And the important thing here is it's very obvious if you look at, price per hectare in 2025, that your price per hectare goes up the more livestock that you have in the system. And even that, looking at these different categories, will not necessarily be very accurate, because, within a mixed system, how many lambs you have, when you're bringing them in, and all sorts of things. There's so many factors to take into account. But this at least gives arable growers a little bit of an idea of what the implications are going to be for their farm under the farm level option, which of the three options is the one that is been modelled to have the lowest direct financial impact if you're just looking at the emissions levy that a farmer would have to pay. So what does that mean? That means that the biggest take-home message that we can give to our growers is you have to know your number, because if you don't know your number, you are not going to be able to work out, sort of what impact any of this is going to have, and you're not going to know, what impact any future pricing scheme that's decided, what impact that's going to have come 2025 or 2030. So FAR has got its e-check greenhouse gas calculator, and we've got links to that, and people really need to get on there and work out what their numbers are so that they can make informed decisions. If we come back to those big considerations that I talked about at the beginning, how are you going to decide, which option is the best? Then, the considerations, what impact is it going to have on me and the wider industry? Have I got any control over it? Will I get a reward or a recognition for anything that I do? And actually, will it make any difference to the big goal of reducing emissions? And so what we did at FAR was we just took everything that we knew so far from all of the discussions that we've been involved in, and we basically put it together into a table that you can see here around, sort of a summary of the three different options. So if you look at impact on farm profit, the ETS is going to be have the greatest financial impact, and the farm level is probably going to have the least. And that's just looking at the emissions levy that you'd have to pay. That's not taking into account the admin costs and the operating cost of establishing new schemes. And if we can talk about that in a minute. Level of farmer control, obviously, is highest at the farm level, and that makes sense because it's your emissions that you're reporting on and that you're paying for. And obviously recognition for emissions reductions, you'll get the highest recognition if you make emissions reductions on your farm. Under the farm level, you will directly get that benefit. Under the others, you'll be brought into national averages. So if you make lots of emissions reductions and nobody else does, then you're just in there amongst, the masses. And then the modelled emissions reductions is that, in fact, the ETS, even though it might have the greatest financial impact, is modelled to actually probably have the least impact on driving farmer behaviour change on farm. And the processor hybrid and the farm level are probably round about the same, getting around about, 4% reduction in methane and, between 1.6 and 1.8 reduction in nitrous oxide, which seems low, but, at the end of the day, without major new technologies coming on board, that is realistically the best that the agricultural sector could do in the short term. I did mention about the scheme costs, and I don't want to go into lots of detail about that. All I'll say is that the ETS is obviously the cheapest because it's already up and running and established. The processor level hybrid version would be more expensive than the ETS, but not as expensive as the farm level. And then the important thing is that, like the money that that will come out of this emissions levy, where is that money going to go? How's it going to be distributed? And we have indicated that with the Hiwaka Ekanoa options, that we would like the revenue to be recycled back into R&D to and on-farm sort of behaviour change support, so that the money that the growers are paying could be recycled back to help them reduce emissions even more. Now, the government has indicated that they would explore some revenue recycling back into agriculture for the ETS as well, but we don't necessarily know, whether that would or wouldn't come to fruition. So the growers, we are encouraging them to fill in the online survey, and we've also given it out as a hard copy in the mail. And the really important thing is for growers to answer the key questions. And most of the questions are around, what is the most important thing to a grower in a pricing scheme? What do they like about the various pricing schemes? What don't they like? And on the basis of the information that we've given them so far, is there one pricing option that they prefer? And any other feedback that they want to give.
So firstly, we get a lot of questions around sequestration and mitigation options for arable. And based on what you've just said and based on what we've heard, there's not a lot there that arable can do. So if an arable grower wants to reduce their emissions, from what I can figure out, they need to reduce the amount of N they're applying, synthetic N, or reduce stock units.
Yes.
Are there any other options that are included or are being considered?
I mean, obviously, if you look at the broader range of sequestration options, I think there are opportunities for arable growers to do some riparian planting, some biodiversity plantings. So, I think that if we're creative, and we could work together as collectives, sort of getting a group of farmers together to look at ways in which they could create some, biodiversity plantings that could generate some credits. But it's not going to be anywhere near the same as what, say, a hill country beef and sheep farmer that could plant up, a whole area of relatively sort of poor grazing land. They could put it into trees and gain a much bigger credit.
Okay, thank you. Now, another question that we've had relates back to what is the definition of a farm. And so on the slide that we saw earlier, it basically for arable, it was 40 tonnes of applied synthetic nitrogen or 550 stock units across the year. That's the same whether you've got 50 hectares, 100 hectares or 1,000 hectares?
If you're looking at it from the point of view of emissions per hectare, it seems incredibly unfair. If you're looking at it from the point of view of, does this capture the vast majority of farms that are that have got, a reasonable amount of emissions occurring, then that basically, I think, was the rationale.
So what if we just ignore it and say, get stuff, don't want anything to do with it, you're not making me consult, I don't care, it's go away.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose if that was a response from the arable sector, but the other sectors engaged, then the arable sector would just have to go along with the recommendation that suited the other sectors, and there might be some perverse outcomes for us. If all of the sectors decided that they were going to do that, then the government would turn around and say, well, that's fine, you're all just in the ETS and you're exposed to the full carbon price.
So in short, it's not going away. It's the ETS is that backstop option. That's what's happening unless something else
That's
comes
right.
in.
I mean, it's in legislation. It is going to happen in 2025, and there's nothing that we can do to stop it other than coming up with something that is more palatable.
So there's still also a lot of uncertainty about the pricing because the carbon price now is already sitting at what they predicted for 2 years' time. So how do we know these costs aren't just going to blow out and be 10 times what the modelers are looking at?
We don't. That's the reality. We don't. So under the ETS, like you are at the mercy of that carbon price. Under the farm level and the processor hybrid, the pricing is going to be determined by an independent advisory group that will have input from and representation by the industries. So both the Hiwaka Ekino options, there is the opportunity to consider a whole range of factors, food security, sort of financial impact on farm systems, as well as driving behaviour change, whereas the ETS is a blunt instrument and it's basically linked to the carbon price. And if the carbon price is $500, then there's an awful lot of farmers that are not going to be very happy.
So a lot of the commentary that we've been getting has been that people they can see all the benefits of the farm levy. However, it seems to involve a bit more work from the growers' part in recording. But how different do you think that data recording and reporting is to what they're already having to do for fresh water or other things?
At this moment in time, it depends on which sector you're in, and which region you're in. So I think that, for a dairy farmer, they have to meet all of those specifications anyway for their processors. The processors require a lot of the data that's needed. It's already being recorded. I think that for, arable growers in Canterbury, because they've already had to be doing farm environment plans and all sorts of things, it would not be that much more expensive or difficult to incorporate a greenhouse gas calculator into the systems that they're operating.
Okay, so final question, this is the big one, because I'm an arable grower, and I still don't quite get all of this data. So can you just tell me what to do? Has FAR got an opinion on what's the best option for the arable industry?
The issue that we have is that it depends on what type of arable farm you are. It may be that for some arable farmers, the processor hybrid version is actually just the easiest. Just pay a little bit more for nitrogen fertilizer, and not worry about having any extra admin costs and not have to report on things. In other cases, if you've got livestock integrated into the system, the processor hybrid would not necessarily be the best, because the processor hybrid, if you finish off lambs or beef, then you would pay for the full cost of the emissions. If we were forced to take a stance, we would probably err on the farm level option, because that gives growers control of their own destiny. Or there's been a push to look at a transition so that everyone would go into the processor hybrid version first and then transition to the farm level. I don't personally fully understand why we would want to invest $150 million in setting up a processor hybrid, and then X number of years later spend another $200 million setting up a farm level. But at this moment in time, I think for our farmers, the farm level possibly, but I can quite easily see that there will be, some growers that will say, well, actually the processor hybrid, and there might even be, a small proportion of growers that just say, oh, just put us in the ETS. We would not be recommending that. And that's what this whole grower engagement is about. It's not about the industry sectors going out and telling the growers which is the best option, but trying to get the growers to consider the options and give feedback, because who knows, we might get some really good ideas of how to do this even better.
Growers listening to this, what we need you to do now is fill out that survey. There's a link on the podcast page to the survey, or if you're not looking at that, you'll find a link in Far Weekly, and it will keep being in Far Weekly for a few weeks yet. Or you can jump onto the Far website, go onto the Environment and Compliance section, and again in there you will find all of the documents associated with Hawaki Ika Noa pricing. So we've done a quick summary today, but there is enough there to keep you busy for weeks if you want to really get down into the deep detail, and the survey link is on that website as well. I'm not quite sure how you feel about me saying this now, but thank you so much for listening, and try and put all the drama out of your mind and have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.